Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. You're about to explore the profound tension between a comforting universe where every move is God's will and the heavy, empowering atheist perspective where you hold the pen to your own life story. We're tearing down the idea of destiny to see what happens to responsibility, justice, and human kindness when we realize our choices might be entirely our own.
Yeah, the materials we're unpacking today, they go straight to the core of human existence.
Right.
We're looking at this massive philosophical clash between the concept of a divine destiny, the idea that a higher power has pre-authored your life, and the stark reality of atheism, where the universe has no script at all.
Which is a huge shift in perspective.
Oh, absolutely. Both frameworks completely alter the architecture of how we experience reality. I mean, they change how we treat the people around us and, well, how we process our own triumphs and failures.
And before we start breaking down these massive life-altering concepts, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because today's deep dive is fundamentally about you.
It really is.
We're pulling apart the very mechanisms of belief and choice to ask, are you actually making decisions today, or are you just playing out a role that was written for you before you were even born?
It's a heavy question. And the sources begin this exploration by looking at a deeply ingrained human instinct.
The whole everything happens for a reason thing, right?
Exactly. Across almost every culture and belief system, you find this incredibly persistent refrain that everything is part of a plan. And we really have to look at the psychological mechanics behind why that is so universally appealing.
Because it's comforting.
Right. The human brain is essentially, well, it's an energy-saving prediction machine. It evolved to recognize patterns because predicting the environment kept our ancestors alive.
Right. If you hear a rustle in the bushes, you need to predict if it's a tiger or just the wind.
Exactly. So when we encounter chaos, randomness, or sudden tragedy, the brain requires an immense amount of biological energy to process that uncertainty.
Which feels terrible.
It feels like terror.
Yeah.
Literally.
So the concept of a master plan acts as, the ultimate cognitive shortcut, I guess.
Yeah, precisely. If a devastating loss or a sudden accident isn't just random, meaningless cruelty, but rather a specific thread in a divine tapestry, the brain doesn't have to spiral in the chaos.
That makes a lot of sense. The pain suddenly has an overarching purpose, even if we can't understand it ourselves.
Right. It completely neutralizes the sheer terror of an unpredictable universe. It acts as a psychological anchor.
By categorizing trauma as purposeful instead of random.
Yes, which literally soothes the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes fear. But the texts point out the silent, often unacknowledged cost of relying on that anchor.
The cost to our own free will.
Exactly. If absolutely everything is planned out in advance by an all-knowing creator, then nothing is truly chosen by the individual. The concept of human agency just gets completely hollowed out.
For choices stop being the actual engine of reality. They just become mere decoration.
Yeah, we're essentially just actors hitting our marks on a stage. We might feel the thrill of improvising our lines, but the director already holds the finalized script.
Wait, but if that's true, if we are just biological puppets playing out a predetermined storyline, then human evolution played a ridiculously cruel trick on us.
How do you mean?
Well, why do we actually experience life as a series of agonizing decisions? Think about the physical toll of making a massive life choice, leaving a career or moving across the country.
Oh, yeah. The stress is immense.
Right. We lose sleep, our cortisol levels spike, we feel this crushing weight of regret when things go wrong. Evolving the capacity for intense anxiety and regret makes absolutely zero biological sense in a world where the results are already fixed in stone.
That physical and emotional friction is the exact contradiction the source material highlights. Regret is basically the perfect stress test for the concept of destiny.
Because regret is that visceral, sickening feeling that you should have done something differently.
Exactly. You replay the scenario in your head, agonizing over a different path. But in a universe ruled by absolute fate or absolute divine will, you could have done anything differently.
The script demanded you take that exact action.
Right. In a purely deterministic universe, feeling regret is as illogical as a rock feeling regret for falling when it's dropped.
Wow. Yeah, if regret is completely illogical under the umbrella of fate, then the fact that we actively feel it must point toward a different reality.
It points toward a framework where we actually hold the pen.
And when we strip away the comforting script of fate, the burden of responsibility suddenly shifts entirely onto our own shoulders.
It does. Because under a strict fate mindset, responsibility is incredibly diffused. A person's massive, unimaginable success can be attributed to divine grace or a cosmic blessing rather than their own relentless hard work.
And the reverse is true too, right?
Yeah. Conversely, their failures, mistakes, or even their moral failings can be softened by writing them off as destiny or God's mysterious ways. The individual is partially removed from the equation.
So when you remove fate entirely, you crash headfirst into the atheist perspective outlined in the texts.
Which is a very different landscape.
Yeah, this worldview is undeniably heavier, but the sources argue it is ultimately much stronger. The atheist perspective dictates that your life belongs to you, without asterisks.
There is no divine safety net.
Right. When you succeed, you don't owe that victory to the cosmos. You actively earned it through your own sweat and intellect, and you must own that triumph.
And the psychological weight of that ownership is staggering, because the inverse is equally true and much more brutal.
When you fail.
Exactly. When you fail, you cannot console yourself by saying, well, it just wasn't meant to be. Failure becomes a harsh, direct reflection of your choices, your miscalculations, or simply the cold indifference of chance.
You have to absorb that failure entirely and learn from it rather than passing the buck to the universe.
Yeah. People often assume that removing a grand, divine designer strips all the meaning out of life. You know, the cliche is that we're just atoms spinning on a rock in a random universe. Nothing matters.
But the texts we're analyzing argue the exact opposite mechanism is at play.
They do. They argue that the lack of a divine plan is actually the very thing that creates authentic meaning.
That's fascinating. How does that work?
Well, consider the mechanics of an act of kindness. If we exist in a pre-written world, your actions are practically mandatory. The script dictated that you would give your spare change to someone on the street.
So it wasn't really a choice.
Right. But in an unplanned atheist universe, you didn't have to do that. The universe didn't force your hand.
Biology might have nudged you toward empathy, but you stepped into the void of an indifferent cosmos and actively manufactured a moment of goodness.
Exactly. It's the difference between a programmed machine bringing you a cup of coffee because its code demands it versus a human being with infinite other options going out of their way to do it.
Because the choice isn't forced by a cosmic script, it becomes infinitely more valuable.
Every preference, every sacrifice, every moment of empathy is entirely authentic because it was generated solely by human volition. We aren't discovering meaning, we are forging it.
That profound shift from discovering meaning to forging it, that doesn't just stay confined to our personal lives, does it?
No, not at all. It ripples outward into how we structure human society. If we accept the premise that there is no divine plan, the entire architecture of justice has to be reevaluated.
Because so many religious frameworks rely heavily on what the sources define as the cosmic guarantor.
Right, the cosmic guarantor.
This is the deep-seated theological assurance that no matter how chaotic or unfair things get on earth, absolute justice will be served in the end.
The wicked will face ultimate punishment, and the righteous who suffered quietly will receive eternal reward in an afterlife.
So the cosmic guarantor operates as the ultimate balancing of the scales.
It does, but we have to look at the psychological effect of believing those scales exist. If you hold a deep conviction that an afterlife will magically fix all cruelty, that belief can inadvertently act as a psychological snooze button for fixing present-day problems.
A snooze button. That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah, because if the pain someone is experiencing right now is merely temporary, and they will be compensated with eternal paradise, the urgency to alleviate their present suffering evaporates.
It creates a massive tolerance for current-day injustice.
Exactly.
But without that cosmic guarantor, the alarm is blaring at full volume right now.
There's no snooze button left to hit.
Right. If there is no afterlife where the scales are balanced, then the cruelty happening today is final. It will never be corrected by the universe.
That heavy realization completely strips away our ability to delay action. We have a sudden, agonizing moral duty to reduce pain immediately because no one is going to do it for us in the next life.
And the sources delve deeply into the societal dangers of leaning too heavily into the concept of fate here, don't they?
They really do. Historically, the belief that everything is God's will has been weaponized by those in power to justify rampant inequality.
Like if a ruling class can convince a society that poverty is simply someone's divine fate.
Or that systemic oppression is just part of God's mysterious plan, yeah. It completely destroys the motivation for the oppressed to revolt.
It frames cruelty and suffering as merely a spiritual test from a higher power.
Right. turning victims into passive actors in a tragedy they are told they must simply endure to reach heaven.
It is the ultimate tool for social control. The people holding all the wealth and power get to look at those suffering and say, don't complain to us, take it up with the scriptwriter. We are all just playing our assigned roles.
But, and this is crucial, we must look at the nuance the sources provide here to remain completely impartial.
Right, because it's not always used that way.
Exactly. While the concept of a divine plan has absolutely been used as a tool for passivity, it's not an inherent rule. Throughout history, many religious movements have interpreted the exact same belief in a divine power as a mandate for radical social justice.
So the belief itself isn't the problem, it's the application.
Yes. For many liberation theologies, the belief in a just God is the very engine that demands they fight against poverty and systemic oppression today. The texts emphasize that the concept of a higher power is a catalyst.
And the direction it pushes a society depends entirely on how the mechanics of that belief are applied by human beings.
Exactly. The same exact text can be read as a command to accept this suffering, or a command to fight this suffering in the name of the divine.
But we can't just limit this deep dive to theology and philosophy, because the moment the sources introduce modern biology and neuroscience.
Oh yeah, the idea of absolute free will takes a massive, devastating hit, regardless of whether you believe in God or not.
Modern science throws its own massive wrench into the gears of human agency.
It really does. Even if you reject the idea of a divine script, we have to grapple with the deterministic nature of biology.
Like the physical architecture of your brain.
Right, your baseline neurochemistry, your genetics, and the environment of your early childhood. None of which you chose. They heavily dictate your behavior.
Like, if you were running on 2 hours of sleep, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for logic, long-term planning, and what we consider free will, is essentially compromised.
It's basically offline.
Right. Control is handed over to the amygdala, the primitive reactive part of the brain. You are biologically primed to make entirely different, often more aggressive or impulsive choices than if you were fully rested.
And if you look at the macro level, the zip code you are born into statistically predicts your income, your health, and your lifespan with terrifying accuracy.
These are unchosen frameworks that build the walls of your reality.
Exactly. The biological and environmental factors act as their own kind of script. But the texts offer a compelling counter-mechanism here.
They do offer some hope.
Yes. Despite the heavy influence of genetics and environment, the human brain possesses neuroplasticity. We have the ability to observe our own programming, to adapt, and to reflect.
The source material uses a really classic analogy to bridge this gap, right?
Yeah, the card game analogy. You have absolutely no say in the cards that are dealt to you. The hand you receive is your biology, your trauma, your socioeconomic starting line.
But the intricate split-second decisions of exactly how to play that hand bluffing, folding, going all in, that is where the margin of your free will exists.
Precisely. The hand is the environment. The play is the volition.
But here is where the sources collide these scientific concepts back into theology, preventing what is easily the most striking paradox of this entire deep dive. Let's look at the mechanics of an all-knowing God.
Yes. This is the paradox that has short-circuited philosophers and theologians for centuries.
A tough one.
It is. By definition, an all-knowing, omniscient God possesses absolute foreknowledge. This deity exists outside of time and knows exactly what you will do every single second of your life before you are even conceived.
So think about the implications of that at the card table. If you sit down to play and the dealer already knows with absolute infallible certainty exactly how you're going to play every single hand before the game even begins.
Are you actually playing the game, or is the game just playing you?
Right. The mathematical tension there is completely unsolvable.
If God's foreknowledge is truly absolute, then your choices are already locked in. You cannot choose differently than what God already knows you will choose.
Because if you did, it would mean God's knowledge was flawed.
Exactly. Which breaks the definition of omniscience. Therefore, from the perspective of the cosmos, your agonizing decisions are just an illusion. You are simply walking down a hallway that has only one door.
And if those decisions aren't truly free, the texts force us to examine how that utterly dismantles the concept of divine justice.
It really complicates things.
Yeah, under a framework of absolute predeterminism, how does the concept of heaven or hell function? Is ending up in eternal reward or eternal punishment actually the result of your free choice? Or is it merely the final, unavoidable act of a destiny written for you?
It creates a labyrinth of moral contradictions. If the grand divine script requires a villain to create contrast, and a human being is born specifically to play that role,
With their ultimate failure known before their first breath.
right, how can they be justly punished for executing the exact role they were designed to play?
They didn't really have a choice.
No.
Yeah.
The entire mechanism of divine judgment relies on the premise that the individual could have chosen otherwise. If omniscience removes the otherwise, the concept of cosmic justice collapses inward on itself.
It is entirely dizzying to process.
Yeah.
I mean, on one side of the spectrum, you have the profound, deeply human comfort of a God who is in complete control, carefully weaving the chaos of life into a meaningful tapestry. But the logical extreme of that absolute control seemed to completely unravel the foundation of human responsibility and the very justice it promises.
And on the other side, you have the raw, heavy atheist perspective.
Yeah. There is no safety net. There is no pre-written script. There's no cosmic guarantor waiting to balance the scale.
There is just you, the weight of your choices, and the immediate, blistering need to make this world fair because the universe is indifferent to our suffering.
Exploring both of these frameworks impartially reveals that neither path is easy, really.
Both require a massive leap of courage from the individual. Believing in a divine plan requires the immense psychological courage to trust an unseen architect while navigating terrible, often senseless suffering.
It demands faith in the dark.
Exactly. And adopting the atheist perspective requires the courage to bear the absolute crushing weight of your own existence, knowing that your mistakes are yours alone and that any justice in the world must be built by human hands.
And that brings this massive philosophical collision right back to you listening to this today. We've mapped out the mechanics of destiny, neuroscience, and cosmic justice. But this is an abstract theory.
No, the framework you lean into dictates how you operate the moment you take your headphones off.
Right. When you look at the raw materials of your life right now, your current struggles, your environment, the unchosen variables of your biology, are you waiting for a grand plan to eventually reveal its purpose?
Or are you looking at the cards in your hand, realizing the dealer has left the table and taking absolute ownership of the next play?
The implications of holding the pen ourselves fundamentally reshape what it means to be moral.
We established that the absence of a cosmic guarantor makes the demand for justice urgent right now because there is no afterlife to fix our mistakes.
The psychological alarm clock blaring, demanding we reduce suffering immediately.
Consider the deepest mechanism of that urgency, though.
What do you mean?
Well, if the intense desire for justice right now is driven by the realization that there is no cosmic backup plan, does that mean our most profound, unselfish acts of human empathy are actually born from the realization of our own cosmic aloneness?
Oh.
The text suggests that the total absence of a divine safety net might be the exact biological and philosophical trigger that makes us truly moral.
Think about the frontier we are crossing right now with that exact logic. We are currently building artificial intelligence machines that run on pure deterministic code, much like the biology and environment that program us.
That's a fascinating parallel.
If we are essentially biological machines, trapped by our own environmental scripts, are we just building another entity trapped by its code? Or, in our desperate search for a grand plan, are we finally trying to build the all-knowing divine scriptwriter we've been looking for all along?
That is quite the thought.
It's something to think about the next time you ask an algorithm to make a choice for you. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep thinking deeper, and we'll catch you next time.